The numbers from Munich 2025 tell a compelling story. European defense spending has risen from 1.43% of GDP in 2014 to 2.02% in 2024, with all NATO allies finally meeting the 2% target. Poland now spends over 4% of GDP on defense, more than any other ally, while the new 5% pledge agreed at The Hague signals unprecedented commitment levels. Military aid to Ukraine continues at record levels, and NATO capabilities have reached new heights on paper. Yet conversations with European security officials reveal a different story, one of growing anxiety about American reliability and urgent discussions about strategic autonomy. The EU's Rearm Europe plan and national debates on defense independence reflect concerns that current statistics don't capture. What happened behind the scenes at Munich reveals the true state of Europe's military future. The Munich reality check. The Munich Security Conference has always been a carefully orchestrated diplomatic theater, but the 2025 gathering revealed something different happening beneath the surface. While public sessions proceeded with their usual formal presentations and measured statements, the real conversations were taking place in hotel corridors, private dining rooms, and hastily arranged bilateral meetings that extended well into the night. European defense officials moved between sessions with an urgency that hadn't been visible in previous years, their expressions reflecting a growing awareness that the fundamental assumptions underlying transatlantic security cooperation were being challenged in real time. The transformation became apparent during the opening sessions when traditional alliance protocols began breaking down in subtle but significant ways. European delegates who typically coordinated their positions with American counterparts found themselves proceeding independently, making statements that reflected distinctly European perspectives rather than coordinated transatlantic messaging. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius delivered remarks that diverged sharply from previous German positions on burden sharing, while his French counterpart outlined military capabilities assessments that seemed designed to demonstrate European self-sufficiency rather than alliance integration. These weren't accidental departures from established diplomatic practice, but calculated signals that something fundamental had shifted in how European leaders viewed their relationship with Washington. J.D. Vance's speech as vice president represented the moment when these underlying tensions became impossible to ignore. The address, delivered to a room packed with NATO defense ministers and security officials, focused primarily on European internal governance rather than security concerns. While previous American vice presidents had used their Munich appearances to reinforce alliance commitments and address specific European security challenges, Vance's presentation seemed deliberately designed to signal American disengagement from traditional leadership responsibilities. The speech contained no references to Article 5 commitments, offered no assurances about continued military support for Ukraine, and failed to address the Russian hybrid warfare activities that had dominated private discussions throughout the conference. Instead of speaking about European security to an audience of defense ministers and military officials working on technical problems like Russian sabotage in the Baltic Sea, Vance barely mentioned collective defense or hybrid threats. The immediate aftermath of Vance's speech triggered emergency corridor meetings among European ministers who found themselves developing contingency plans for scenarios that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A hastily convened session of Nordic defense ministers resulted in immediate commitments to accelerate regional defense cooperation initiatives that had been planned for implementation over several years. Eastern European representatives held parallel discussions about developing independent early warning systems and intelligence sharing arrangements that could function without American participation. These weren't long-term planning exercises, but urgent responses to immediate security challenges that European leaders realized they would have to address independently. The question and answer session that followed exposed the full extent of the disconnect between American and European priorities. When asked directly about American commitments to Baltic Sea security in light of recent Russian sabotage activities, Vance provided a response that focused on American economic interests rather than security guarantees. His answer prompted an immediate follow-up question from a Swedish delegate about NATO Article 5 obligations, which received an equally evasive response that left European officials visibly frustrated. The exchange highlighted how traditional alliance protocols for addressing security concerns had become inadequate for managing the new reality of American foreign policy unpredictability. Behind the scenes, the conference's carefully planned schedule began falling apart as European delegations requested emergency consultations and bilateral meetings. The German delegation canceled a planned session on defense industrial cooperation to hold urgent discussions with their French counterparts about coordinated responses to American policy shifts. Polish officials extended their stay to participate in hastily arranged meetings with Baltic and Nordic representatives, creating informal working groups that operated outside traditional NATO frameworks. The private conversations revealed the depth of European concerns about American reliability. Defense officials who had spent decades building relationships with their American counterparts found themselves discussing alternative security arrangements and independent capability development with unprecedented urgency. A senior French military official noted that European nations were being forced to consider defense scenarios that assumed minimal American participation, fundamentally altering how they approached everything from procurement decisions to operational planning. These weren't theoretical discussions about future possibilities, but practical assessments of immediate requirements for maintaining European security without predictable American support. Traditional diplomatic norms that had governed transatlantic relations for decades were being rewritten in real time throughout the conference. European delegations began coordinating positions before consulting with American counterparts, reversing the established practice of transatlantic coordination that had characterized previous Munich gatherings. The informal reception protocols that typically reinforced alliance hierarchy were quietly abandoned as European officials held separate gatherings to discuss sensitive security matters without American participation. These changes weren't announced or formalized, but emerged organically as European leaders adapted to the new reality of American disengagement from traditional leadership responsibilities. The most striking aspect of the conference was how quickly European officials adapted to operating without American guidance on security matters. Sessions that would normally have featured coordinated transatlantic presentations instead showcased distinctly European perspectives on defense challenges and potential solutions. When Russian hybrid warfare activities in the Baltic Sea were discussed, European delegates outlined response mechanisms that assumed limited American involvement, marking a significant departure from previous approaches that had relied heavily on American intelligence and military capabilities. This shift wasn't presented as a choice, but as a necessary adaptation to changing circumstances that European leaders could no longer ignore. The growing realization that Europe could no longer rely on predictable American leadership became evident in how conference participants approached traditional alliance topics. Discussions about NATO defense spending targets were reframed as questions about European capability development rather than burden-sharing obligations to American taxpayers. Conversations about military aid to Ukraine focused on sustainable European contribution levels rather than coordinated transatlantic support packages. These weren't subtle shifts in emphasis, but fundamental changes in how European leaders conceptualized their security responsibilities and capability requirements. By the conference's conclusion, European strategic autonomy had transformed from a distant aspiration discussed in academic circles to an urgent operational requirement that demanded immediate attention and resources. The private assessments shared among European defense officials painted a clear picture of nations that could no longer assume American security guarantees would remain constant or predictable, forcing them to develop independent capabilities and coordination mechanisms with unprecedented speed and determination. Yet the practical reality of achieving this independence would prove far more complex than the political declarations suggested, particularly when examining the actual numbers behind Europe's defense investments. The defense spending paradox. The 2025 NATO spending statistics present a puzzling contradiction that defense officials are struggling to explain. 23 NATO allies now meet or exceed the 2% GDP defense spending target, compared to just 3 nations in 2014. European allies and Canada have increased their combined defense investment from 1.43% of GDP in 2014 to 2.02% in 2024, representing over $430 billion in annual spending. Poland leads this surge with defense expenditure exceeding 4% of GDP, while Germany, France, and the United Kingdom have all substantially increased their military budgets. Yet despite these record-breaking investments, European security vulnerabilities remain glaring and in some cases have actually worsened. The new commitment agreed at The Hague represents an even more dramatic escalation. NATO allies pledged to invest 5% of GDP by 2035, including 3.5% for core defense requirements and 1.5% for defense-related spending covering critical infrastructure protection and industrial base strengthening. This target more than doubles existing guidelines and demonstrates European willingness to shoulder unprecedented financial burdens in response to Russian aggression and American pressure. However, the capability gaps that prompted this massive spending increase persist despite years of sustained investment growth. The fundamental problem lies in how European nations are translating financial commitments into actual military capabilities. Germany plans €329 billion in defense spending by 2035 to reach the 5% GDP target, yet the Bundeswehr still faces critical shortages in ammunition, spare parts, and operational equipment. France has maintained defense spending above NATO targets for years, but French military officials privately acknowledge that their forces would struggle to sustain high-intensity operations for extended periods without American logistical support. The United Kingdom's defense budget has grown substantially, yet British naval capacity remains insufficient to secure vital shipping lanes independently. These capability shortfalls become more troubling when examined against the backdrop of European defense procurement patterns. A significant portion of increased European defense spending flows directly to American defense contractors rather than building indigenous European capabilities. The F-35 fighter program alone absorbs billions in European defense budgets while creating minimal European industrial capacity or technological independence. German orders for American Patriot missile systems, Dutch purchases of American air defense platforms, and widespread European reliance on American satellite communications systems demonstrate how current spending patterns may actually increase rather than reduce dependence on American military technology. The bureaucratic obstacles preventing efficient defense procurement represent another critical factor limiting the effectiveness of increased spending. European defense ministries operate under procurement regulations designed for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime urgency, creating approval processes that can extend equipment acquisition timelines by years. German defense procurement procedures require multiple parliamentary approvals and extensive environmental assessments that delay critical capability developments. French military officials report that bureaucratic requirements for competitive bidding processes prevent rapid acquisition of urgently needed systems. These procedural constraints mean that increased defense budgets often translate into longer procurement timelines rather than faster capability development. Industrial bottlenecks present even more fundamental challenges to European defense capability development. The European defense industrial base has struggled to scale up production capacity to meet rising demand since 2022, creating significant supply chain constraints that limit the effectiveness of increased spending. Artillery ammunition production remains a particular concern, with European manufacturers unable to meet current demand levels despite substantial orders and financial commitments. The limited capacity of European shipyards to produce naval vessels quickly enough to replace aging fleets means that increased spending cannot immediately translate into enhanced maritime capabilities. The timeline challenges facing European defense industrial capacity expansion reveal the long-term nature of the capability development problem. Building new production facilities for complex military systems requires years of investment and development before reaching operational capacity. European defense companies report that establishing new ammunition production lines takes approximately 3 years from initial investment to full production capability. Aircraft manufacturing capacity expansion requires even longer timelines, with new production facilities typically needing 5 to 7 years before reaching full operational capacity. These industrial realities mean that even massive immediate investments in defense spending cannot quickly resolve current capability gaps. The strategic implications of current European defense investment choices raise serious questions about long-term autonomy prospects. European nations continue to prioritize interoperability with American systems over developing independent capabilities, creating procurement decisions that maintain technological dependence even as spending increases. The choice to purchase American rather than European air defense systems may provide immediate capabilities but undermines long-term strategic autonomy by maintaining reliance on American maintenance, upgrades, and technological support. Similarly, European investments in American satellite communications and intelligence systems create dependencies that could prove problematic if American support becomes unreliable. Defense inflation represents another factor limiting the effectiveness of increased European military spending. Defense sector inflation consistently outpaces general economic inflation, meaning that nominal spending increases often yield modest real capability gains. The limited competition in defense markets and lack of economies of scale in European production contribute to market rigidities that push up costs and prices. A senior German defense official noted that procurement costs for identical systems have increased by 40% since 2022, effectively reducing the capability gains from increased spending. These inflationary pressures mean that even the dramatic spending increases represented by the 5% GDP target may not translate into proportional capability improvements. The European Union's response to these challenges includes allowing member states to raise defense spending by 1.5% of GDP annually for 4 years without triggering deficit disciplinary measures, along with creating a €150 billion arms fund using joint EU borrowing for defense projects. While these measures facilitate increased spending, they do not address the fundamental industrial and bureaucratic constraints that limit capability development effectiveness. The creation of financial mechanisms for defense spending does not resolve the underlying problems of production capacity, technological dependence, and procurement efficiency that prevent European nations from achieving security autonomy. The lack of transparency surrounding the new capability targets announced as part of the NATO defense planning process compounds these problems. The classified nature of these targets means that defense budgets designed to address specific capability requirements are developed without public scrutiny or democratic oversight. This opacity undermines responsible resource management and makes it difficult to assess whether increased spending actually addresses the most critical security vulnerabilities facing European nations. Private assessments from European defense officials reveal deep concern that current spending levels, despite their historic scale, may prove insufficient for achieving true strategic independence. The combination of industrial constraints, bureaucratic inefficiencies, technological dependencies, and defense inflation creates a situation where even unprecedented financial commitments may not translate into the military capabilities necessary for European security autonomy. These spending challenges become particularly acute when examining Europe's most immediate test of strategic independence, maintaining support for Ukraine while American political priorities shift in unpredictable directions. Ukraine aid under pressure. The shifting landscape of American political priorities has forced European leaders into uncomfortable calculations about Ukraine's support that extend far beyond current budget allocations. The United States has provided nearly $183 billion for the Ukraine response since February 2022, with $130.1 billion obligated and $86.7 billion disbursed as of September 2024. This massive commitment creates dependencies that European officials are now scrambling to address as American political dynamics suggest potential reductions in future support levels. However, the narrative of European dependence on American aid requires careful examination of the actual numbers. According to the Kiel Institute's Ukraine Support Tracker, total European commitments to Ukraine now exceed €150 billion, roughly double U.S. pledges in some metrics when accounting for financial aid, humanitarian assistance, and refugee support costs. European military aid to Ukraine totals approximately €48.3 billion from EU institutions and member states combined, while the European Peace Facility has mobilized €11.1 billion specifically for Ukrainian military needs. These figures reveal a more complex picture than simple American dominance, though critical asymmetries remain in specific capability areas. The logistical challenges facing European nations in maintaining current aid levels independently reveal critical vulnerabilities in European defense supply chains. American military aid includes sophisticated weapons systems, ammunition, and logistical support that European nations cannot easily replace from their own production capacity. The United States has provided advanced air defense systems, long-range precision weapons, and intelligence capabilities that European alternatives cannot match in quantity or technological sophistication. European officials acknowledge privately that maintaining current Ukrainian military effectiveness without American support would require fundamental changes in how European nations approach defense procurement and production. European defense industrial capacity constraints limit the ability to replace American military aid even with increased financial commitments. Artillery ammunition production remains a particular bottleneck, with European manufacturers unable to meet current demand levels despite substantial orders. The EU has allocated €500 million specifically to boost ammunition production capacity, but building new production facilities requires years of development time before reaching operational capacity. European defense companies report that establishing new ammunition production lines takes approximately 3 years from initial investment to full production capability, creating a significant gap between political commitments and actual delivery capabilities. The sustainability of current European aid levels depends on public support that shows signs of strain in several key contributing nations. German polls show declining support for high-level aid to Ukraine, reflecting domestic fatigue documented in Politico and Kiel Institute reports. French officials report similar concerns about public fatigue with military spending that benefits Ukrainian rather than French security interests. These domestic political pressures create constraints on European leaders' ability to maintain current aid levels over extended periods, particularly if American support decreases and European nations face pressure to increase their contributions. Different European nations are positioning themselves for various Ukraine war scenarios in ways that reveal divergent strategic calculations. Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, advocate for maximum military support to Ukraine regardless of American policy changes, viewing Ukrainian success as essential to their own security. Western European nations, including Germany and France, show more ambivalence about open-ended military commitments that could strain their defense budgets and public support. These different approaches create coordination challenges for developing unified European responses to potential American policy shifts. The European Union Military Assistance Mission Ukraine received €382 million in funding through November 2024, including €241.8 million for common costs and €140.2 million for training equipment. This mission provides individual, collective, and specialized training for Ukrainian forces while coordinating member state activities. However, the mission's scope remains limited compared to American training programs and cannot fully compensate for potential reductions in American military advisors and technical support. The mission's extension through November 2026, with nearly €409 million in total funding, demonstrates European commitment, but also highlights the relatively modest scale of European training contributions. Private discussions among European leaders reveal growing concern about the sustainability of current support levels without American participation. A senior German defense official noted that European nations face difficult choices between maintaining current aid levels to Ukraine and investing in their own defense capabilities. French military planners acknowledge that continued high-level support to Ukraine could delay necessary investments in French military modernization programs. These internal debates reflect the reality that European defense resources, while substantial, remain finite and must balance multiple competing priorities. The industrial implications of replacing American military aid extend beyond immediate production capacity to fundamental questions about European defense technological independence. American weapon systems provided to Ukraine often require American maintenance, spare parts, and technical support that European nations cannot provide. European defense officials worry that similar dependencies in weapon systems provided to Ukraine could create ongoing obligations that persist long after the current conflict ends. Contingency plans being developed for scenarios where American support dramatically decreases focus on maintaining critical capabilities rather than matching current aid levels. European planners are identifying the minimum military support necessary to prevent Ukrainian military collapse, while acknowledging that reduced American aid would likely require accepting limitations in Ukrainian offensive capabilities. These plans prioritize defensive weapon systems and ammunition supplies that European nations can realistically provide from their own production capacity, even if this means accepting reduced Ukrainian military effectiveness. The Ukraine aid challenge has become a test case for European strategic independence that extends beyond the current conflict to fundamental questions about European defense capabilities. European inability to replace American military aid would demonstrate continued dependence on American security guarantees, even in conflicts directly affecting European security interests. Financial mechanisms created to support increased European defense spending provide tools for maintaining Ukraine aid, but do not address underlying capacity constraints that European political systems may struggle to resolve quickly enough to prevent dangerous capability gaps. Yet even as European leaders grapple with these Ukraine support challenges, they face more immediate security threats that demand urgent attention and resources, particularly in regions where traditional alliance frameworks prove inadequate for addressing emerging forms of conflict. The Baltic Sea battleground. Russian hybrid warfare activities in the Baltic Sea have reached levels that defense officials describe as unprecedented since the Cold War ended. 11 separate incidents of undersea cable damage occurred in the Baltic Sea during 2024, each representing critical vulnerabilities in European communications and energy infrastructure. These attacks target fiber optic cables that carry internet traffic, financial transactions, and government communications between European nations, creating disruptions that affect everything from banking systems to military coordination networks. The pattern of damage suggests systematic targeting rather than accidental incidents, with Russian vessels consistently present in areas where cable cuts occur. The economic implications of these infrastructure attacks extend far beyond immediate repair costs. When the Baltic Connector gas pipeline suffered sabotage, it forced Finland to reroute gas supplies and drove EU energy price spikes across European markets. The damage to communication cables has forced European telecommunications companies to reroute traffic through alternative networks, increasing costs and reducing network reliability. Financial institutions report intermittent disruptions to trading systems and cross-border payment networks, creating uncertainty that affects market confidence and economic stability throughout the region. Estonia has experienced a notable spike in cyber attacks against critical infrastructure since 2024, with satellite-based attacks disrupting airport operations and creating safety concerns for civilian air traffic. These incidents demonstrate how Russian hybrid warfare combines physical infrastructure attacks with cyber operations to maximize disruption while maintaining plausible deniability. The targeting of airport systems represents a particular escalation because it affects both civilian safety and military logistics capabilities that European nations depend on for defense operations. The Russian Shadow Fleet has emerged as a primary tool for conducting these covert operations throughout the Baltic Sea. Estonia is actively working to track this Shadow Fleet, which has increased its activities substantially over the past year. These vessels operate under flags of convenience and use deceptive identification systems to avoid detection while conducting surveillance and sabotage operations. The Shadow Fleet poses environmental risks through substandard safety practices and security threats through its role in facilitating infrastructure attacks that traditional naval forces struggle to prevent or respond to effectively. Traditional NATO structures face significant challenges in addressing these hybrid attacks because they operate below the threshold that would trigger Article 5 collective defense provisions. Cable cutting and infrastructure sabotage create substantial economic and strategic damage without constituting the direct military attack that NATO frameworks were designed to address. This gap between hybrid warfare tactics and traditional alliance response mechanisms leaves European nations vulnerable to continued attacks that gradually degrade their security capabilities without provoking formal military responses. Baltic and Nordic nations have developed independent response mechanisms that operate outside traditional NATO frameworks to address these immediate threats. The Finnish Defense Forces assessed in January 2025 that Russia will likely increase the use of all hybrid methods as it seeks to cause disunity within NATO and the European Union. This assessment prompted Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Baltic states to establish bilateral coordination mechanisms for sharing intelligence about suspicious vessel movements and coordinating responses to infrastructure attacks without waiting for formal NATO authorization. Legal and diplomatic challenges complicate efforts to respond effectively to these attacks because they exist in gray zones between civilian law enforcement and military action. When Russian vessels damage undersea cables in international waters, the legal framework for response remains unclear and enforcement mechanisms are limited. European nations cannot treat these incidents as acts of war without triggering broader conflict, yet treating them as criminal matters provides insufficient deterrent effect and limited practical remedies for preventing future attacks. NATO has responded to these challenges by launching Baltic Sentry in January 2025, a new military activity designed to improve Allied response capabilities to destabilizing acts. This initiative brings together Allied navies, maritime surveillance assets, and private sector operators to ensure real-time situational awareness across the Baltic Sea's vulnerable zones. The program represents a shift toward more proactive deterrence measures that emphasize rapid response capabilities rather than traditional threat assessment and consultation processes. The alliance has also established a critical undersea infrastructure coordination cell at NATO headquarters in Brussels and launched a maritime center for the security of critical undersea infrastructure at its maritime command in Northwood. These institutional responses demonstrate recognition that hybrid warfare requires specialized capabilities and coordination mechanisms that traditional military structures were not designed to provide. The center's focus on intelligence sharing and incident response rather than conventional military operations, reflecting the unique challenges posed by infrastructure-focused attacks. Countries neighboring Russia, including Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, represent the most attractive targets for sabotage operations according to intelligence assessments. These nations face the highest risk of infrastructure attacks because of their geographic proximity to Russia and their strong support for Ukraine. Germany and Poland face almost certainly greater risk of physical threats than countries that do not provide significant aid to Ukraine, creating a direct connection between European support for Ukraine and exposure to Russian hybrid warfare activities. The coordination mechanisms being established among affected nations for rapid response include shared intelligence databases, joint patrol operations, and coordinated diplomatic responses to suspected attacks. These mechanisms operate through bilateral agreements and regional frameworks rather than formal NATO structures, enabling faster decision-making and more flexible responses to emerging threats. The Nordic Defense Cooperation Framework has been expanded to include intelligence sharing about suspicious vessel movements and coordinated responses to infrastructure attacks. Baltic Sea security has become a proving ground for European independent defense capabilities because it requires sustained operations, advanced technological systems, and international coordination without relying on American military support. The region's geography makes it ideal for testing European naval capabilities, surveillance systems, and rapid response mechanisms under realistic threat conditions. Success in securing Baltic Sea infrastructure would demonstrate European ability to address complex security challenges independently, while failure would highlight continued dependence on American capabilities and leadership. The suspected Russian operations in the first half of 2025, including undersea infrastructure surveillance off the British coast and damage to water supply systems on Sweden's Gotland Island, demonstrate the expanding scope of hybrid warfare beyond traditional military targets. These attacks represent levels of infrastructure targeting that exceed typical hybrid warfare activities since the Cold War, forcing European nations to develop new response capabilities and coordination mechanisms that traditional alliance structures cannot provide. The regional approach emerging among smaller European nations offers a potential model for addressing these challenges more effectively than existing frameworks allow. The Scandinavian solution. Nordic and Baltic nations have created operational frameworks that demonstrate how smaller European powers can achieve security results that larger allies struggle to match. These countries have established coordination mechanisms that operate with speed and precision that larger NATO members cannot replicate. While Germany debates procurement procedures and France navigates complex coalition politics, Nordic and Baltic states make rapid decisions and implement them through streamlined command structures designed for immediate response to emerging threats. Their approach emphasizes practical cooperation over theoretical frameworks, creating operational capabilities that exceed what their individual populations and economies might suggest possible. Poland leads this transformation with defense spending that allocates 5% of its GDP to military modernization, the highest percentage among all NATO members. This investment represents more than symbolic commitment because it translates into tangible capabilities that Polish forces can deploy immediately. The country has purchased advanced air defense systems, modernized its armored vehicle fleet, and established ammunition production facilities that contribute to broader European defense capacity. Polish military exercises now feature equipment and training standards that rival those of much larger European armies, demonstrating how focused investment and clear strategic priorities can produce results that bureaucratic processes in larger nations cannot achieve. Sweden's NATO membership has fundamentally transformed regional security architecture by creating defensive depth and operational flexibility that did not exist when the country maintained neutrality. The integration process proceeded rapidly because Swedish military capabilities already met NATO standards and Swedish defense industries had established relationships with alliance partners. Swedish participation in Baltic Sea security operations brings advanced naval capabilities and intelligence systems that complement existing regional defenses. The country's geographic position creates opportunities for coordinated responses to Russian activities that would be impossible without Swedish participation, effectively turning the Baltic Sea into a more defensible space through enhanced surveillance and rapid response capabilities. The defense capabilities achieved by these smaller nations often exceed those of larger European powers when measured against their specific security requirements and operational environments. Estonia has developed cyber defense capabilities that protect critical infrastructure more effectively than systems operated by much larger countries. Finnish border security and intelligence operations demonstrate proficiency in monitoring and responding to Russian activities that larger nations with more resources struggle to match. These capabilities result from focused investment in specific requirements rather than attempting to maintain broad military capabilities across multiple domains that stretch resources and reduce effectiveness. Cultural and political factors enable rapid defense transformation in these societies because their populations understand the immediate nature of security threats and support necessary investments without extensive political debate. Public opinion polls consistently show strong support for defense spending and military cooperation in Nordic and Baltic countries, creating political space for leaders to make rapid decisions about equipment purchases and operational commitments. The absence of significant anti-military sentiment allows governments to implement defense policies without extensive consultation processes that slow decision-making in larger European democracies. Citizens in these countries view defense spending as essential rather than optional, creating political stability that enables long-term planning and investment. Joint training exercises between Nordic and Baltic nations now occur monthly rather than annually, creating persistent operational relationships that enable rapid coordination during actual security incidents. These exercises focus on practical scenarios involving hybrid warfare, infrastructure protection, and rapid response to emerging threats rather than theoretical military operations. Swedish forces now participate in Estonian cyber defense exercises, while Finnish intelligence units work with Polish border security operations. The training programs emphasize interoperability and shared procedures that enable forces from different countries to operate together without extensive coordination delays that would reduce response effectiveness. Equipment sharing arrangements have evolved beyond traditional procurement cooperation to include operational sharing of advanced systems during peacetime. Nordic air defense systems now provide coverage for Baltic airspace through integrated command structures that operate continuously rather than only during exercises. Finnish surveillance systems monitor Russian border activities and share intelligence with Estonian forces in real time. These arrangements create operational capabilities that exceed what individual nations could achieve independently while reducing costs and improving effectiveness through shared resources and expertise. Defense industrial cooperation among these nations operates independently of larger European powers and focuses on specific capabilities rather than attempting to compete with major defense contractors. Estonian companies produce electronic warfare systems that Finnish forces use operationally, while Swedish defense firms provide advanced sensors that enhance Polish border monitoring capabilities. This cooperation emphasizes practical solutions to immediate problems rather than developing comprehensive defense industries that would require massive investment and extensive timelines. The industrial partnerships create supply chains that can respond quickly to changing requirements without dependence on approval processes from larger European bureaucracies. Intelligence sharing and early warning systems created for regional threats operate through bilateral agreements and informal networks that enable rapid information exchange without bureaucratic delays. Finnish intelligence services now provide real-time assessment of Russian military activities to Estonian forces, while Swedish signals intelligence systems monitor Baltic Sea communications and share relevant information with Polish maritime forces. These systems operate continuously and provide tactical intelligence that enables immediate responses to emerging threats rather than strategic assessments that require extensive analysis and consultation processes. NATO's Baltic Sentry activity represents formal recognition of the regional approach these nations have developed, while Russia's union state with Belarus demonstrates the hybrid threats they face. The revenue from immobilized Russian assets began flowing to Ukraine assistance in late 2024, creating additional pressure on regional security arrangements that these countries must address through their coordination mechanisms. The model developed by these nations could be scaled up to include larger European powers by focusing on specific capabilities rather than attempting to replicate comprehensive defense structures. However, scaling up would require larger nations to adopt the streamlined decision-making processes and focused investment priorities that enable smaller countries to achieve rapid results. The bureaucratic constraints and political complexities that characterize larger European democracies would need fundamental transformation to enable effective participation in the Nordic-Baltic model. This regional approach proves more effective than traditional NATO or EU-wide initiatives because it operates at a scale that enables rapid decision-making and implementation without requiring consensus among dozens of member states with different priorities and capabilities. The success stems from geographic proximity that creates shared threat perceptions and operational environments that enable practical cooperation. These nations face similar challenges from Russian hybrid warfare activities and share borders or maritime boundaries that create natural cooperation opportunities. The Nordic-Baltic model demonstrates that effective defense cooperation requires shared understanding and compatible capabilities rather than formal institutional structures that may impede practical cooperation. Yet, this regional success raises questions about whether larger European powers can adopt similar approaches, particularly those nations whose defense cultures have been shaped by decades of different strategic assumptions and political constraints. Germany's defense awakening. Germany's Zeitenwende policy represents the most dramatic shift in European defense priorities since reunification, fundamentally altering how the continent's largest economy approaches military spending and strategic responsibilities. The debt-funded €100 billion special fund approved by the Bundestag signals recognition that decades of minimal defense investment left the Bundeswehr critically underfunded and operationally limited. Germany's defense expenditure reached approximately 1.9% of GDP in 2024, with NATO estimates projecting an increase to 2.04% in 2025 to meet alliance targets. This financial commitment extends beyond immediate requirements, with plans to allocate an additional €30 billion annually starting in 2028 to maintain NATO's 2% target consistently, rather than treating it as a temporary adjustment. The specific changes in German military spending reflect priorities that would have been impossible to imagine just 3 years ago. Germany is investing heavily in modern systems, including Meekschnick frigates and Patriot air defense batteries, representing capabilities designed for high-intensity conflict rather than peacekeeping operations. These procurement decisions demonstrate Germany's acceptance that its military must prepare for scenarios involving direct confrontation with peer adversaries rather than focusing primarily on international stabilization missions. The Patriot systems specifically address air defense vulnerabilities that became apparent as Russian missile attacks against Ukraine demonstrated the critical importance of protecting civilian infrastructure and military installations from aerial threats. Force structure modifications throughout the Bundeswehr indicate a shift toward capabilities required for territorial defense and collective security operations. German military units are receiving equipment designed for sustained combat operations rather than short-term deployments, reflecting planning assumptions that future conflicts may require extended engagement periods. The emphasis on maritime capabilities through frigate investments addresses Germany's responsibilities in the Baltic Sea region, where Russian hybrid warfare activities require persistent naval presence and advanced surveillance systems. These force structure changes represent practical adaptations to security challenges that German military planners now consider likely rather than theoretical possibilities. Public support for increased defense spending has risen above 60% according to Kiel Institute surveys, representing a dramatic shift from previous polling that found Germans reluctant to support military investments. A former German officer noted a change in the perception of soldiers in uniform, indicating that the anti-militarism that characterized German culture for decades is giving way to acceptance of military necessity. This cultural change creates political space for leaders to make defense decisions without facing the public opposition that would have been inevitable in previous decades. The movement from pacifist culture to accepting European military leadership represents a psychological transformation that extends beyond policy changes to fundamental questions about German identity and international responsibilities. German political leaders now speak openly about military deterrence and defense capabilities in ways that would have been politically impossible before 2022. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's declaration of a Zeitenwende marked the beginning of this transition, but the practical implementation has required overcoming deeply embedded cultural resistance to military power projection. The acceptance of leadership responsibilities means that Germany must develop capabilities that other European nations can rely upon rather than maintaining forces designed primarily for symbolic participation in alliance operations. Political challenges facing German leaders as they navigate this transformation include managing coalition dynamics that reflect different attitudes toward military spending and international engagement. The Social Democratic Party's traditional skepticism about military investments creates internal government tensions that require careful management to maintain policy coherence. Opposition parties critique both the pace and scale of defense investments, creating political pressure that could undermine long-term planning if public support for increased spending weakens. The need to balance defense investments with other budgetary priorities becomes particularly challenging given Germany's relatively low economic growth rates, which limit the government's ability to increase military spending without reducing other expenditures. Timeline constraints for German military modernization create urgency that conflicts with traditional procurement procedures and planning processes. The country faces the challenge of compensating for years of insufficient funding within a compressed timeframe while maintaining quality standards and cost efficiency. Modernization programs typically require years of development and testing before reaching operational capacity, but current security threats demand accelerated timelines that stress existing procurement systems. The government is considering exempting defense investments from national debt limits, recognizing that security requirements may justify fiscal policies that would be inappropriate for other spending categories. German defense industrial capacity, rebuilding after decades of decline, requires comprehensive restructuring of production capabilities and supply chains. The government has launched a defense industry strategy designed to create political, economic, and regulatory frameworks that make German defense industries more innovative, agile, and resilient. European artillery ammunition supply lines take 3 years to establish from initial investment to operational capacity, illustrating the long lead times that constrain rapid capability development. This industrial policy represents a reversal of previous approaches that allowed defense production capacity to atrophy in favor of civilian industrial priorities. The rebuilding process must address skill shortages, production facility limitations, and supply chain vulnerabilities that developed during decades of minimal defense investment. Specific military capabilities Germany is developing to lead European defense include advanced air defense systems, maritime patrol capabilities, and intelligence gathering technologies that can support broader European security operations. The country is establishing itself as a regional security provider with defense and deterrence strategies designed for collective security of NATO allies bordering the Baltic Sea. German participation in multinational exercises like Buildups, involving 20 countries and over 9,000 personnel, demonstrates commitment to strengthening NATO readiness in critical regions. These capabilities emphasize interoperability and shared operational procedures that enable German forces to coordinate effectively with allied militaries. Defense cooperation with other European nations has evolved from symbolic participation to substantive operational integration through initiatives like the German-Polish Action Plan. This cooperation includes intensified naval cooperation in the Baltic Sea region and enhanced Allied land and maritime command and control systems. The partnership approach reflects recognition that German defense capabilities must complement rather than compete with other European military investments. Streamlined procurement processes and expanded production capacities focus on developing a stronger European defense industrial base that reduces dependence on non-European suppliers. Remaining obstacles preventing Germany from fully embracing its defense leadership role include procurement regulations designed for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime urgency, creating approval processes that extend equipment acquisition timelines significantly. Parliamentary oversight requirements, while maintaining democratic accountability, can delay critical capability developments when rapid response to emerging threats is necessary. Environmental assessment procedures and competitive bidding processes reflect values that may conflict with military procurement urgency. The challenge of recruiting sufficient personnel for expanded military capabilities compounds these structural obstacles, particularly given Germany's demographic trends and civilian employment opportunities that compete with military service. The transformation requires sustained political commitment that extends beyond current government coalitions to encompass long-term strategic planning that can survive electoral cycles and changing political priorities. Germany's defense awakening demonstrates how established European powers can adapt to new security realities, yet the pace and scale of change required may favor nations with different institutional structures and strategic cultures. The Eastern European advantage. Eastern European nations have emerged as the operational backbone of European defense readiness through strategic necessity and geographic reality that creates immediate operational requirements rather than theoretical planning frameworks. These nations operate from a fundamental understanding that their security depends primarily on their own capabilities rather than assumptions about allied support, creating defense policies that prioritize immediate readiness over long-term diplomatic considerations. The urgency driving their military modernization efforts stems from direct experience with Russian aggression and proximity to ongoing conflict that makes abstract security discussions concrete operational requirements. Poland exemplifies this transformation through defense spending that reaches 5% of GDP, according to Kiel Institute data, a commitment that dwarfs the efforts of much larger Western European economies. Lithuania demonstrates similar commitment by providing 1.7% of GDP in aid to Ukraine, representing the highest per capita contribution among all supporting nations. This investment level represents more than financial commitment because it translates into immediate capability development through streamlined procurement processes and focused strategic priorities. Polish military modernization includes advanced air defense systems, modern armor vehicles, and maritime capabilities that provide immediate operational value rather than serving symbolic alliance participation. The strategic advantages these nations possess stem from geographic positioning that creates natural understanding of threat environments and operational requirements. Their location on NATO's eastern flank provides direct exposure to Russian military activities and hybrid warfare operations that Western European nations experience primarily through intelligence reports and media coverage. This geographic reality creates threat perception that drives immediate capability development rather than theoretical planning for potential future conflicts. Eastern European defense officials make decisions based on current operational requirements rather than speculative assessments of distant possibilities, enabling rapid adaptation to changing security conditions. Eastern European defense industries are filling capability gaps that Western European underinvestment has created across multiple domains. Polish defense manufacturers now produce ammunition, electronic warfare systems, and surveillance equipment that other European nations purchase because their own industrial capacity proves insufficient for current demand levels. Estonian companies develop cyber defense technologies that protect critical infrastructure more effectively than systems operated by larger countries with greater resources. These industrial capabilities result from focused investment in specific requirements rather than attempting to maintain comprehensive defense production across all military domains. Public support for defense spending remains consistently high across the region, with Baltic and Polish populations showing support levels above 70% according to national polling data. This support enables political leaders to implement rapid military modernization programs without extensive consultation processes that characterize Western European democracies where defense spending competes with social programs for public support. Political stability created by this consensus enables long-term planning and immediate resource allocation that bureaucratic constraints prevent in larger European countries. These nations develop independent defense capabilities while maintaining NATO ties through bilateral agreements and regional cooperation frameworks that operate parallel to traditional alliance structures. The German-Polish Action Plan establishes intensified cooperation between Polish and German navies in the Baltic Sea region while enhancing Allied land and maritime command and control through new NATO naval command centers. This cooperation demonstrates how Eastern European nations leverage alliance relationships to enhance their capabilities while maintaining operational independence that enables rapid response to emerging threats without waiting for alliance-wide consensus. American military partnerships enhance Eastern European capabilities through programs including the European Deterrence Initiative, Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, Foreign Military Financing, and Presidential Drawdown Authority. These partnerships provide access to advanced military technologies, training programs, and intelligence sharing that accelerate capability development beyond what independent procurement could achieve. American military aid to Ukraine between January 2022 and January 2023 totaled $46.6 billion, demonstrating the scale of support that enables Eastern European nations to maintain military readiness while providing substantial assistance to Ukrainian forces. The specific military technologies these nations prioritize reflect operational requirements for territorial defense and rapid response to hybrid warfare threats. Poland's acquisition of Munich frigates and Patriot air defense batteries demonstrates commitment to integrated deterrence and defense, including maritime domain capabilities. These systems provide immediate operational value for protecting critical infrastructure and territorial integrity rather than serving primarily as alliance interoperability platforms. The focus on air defense, maritime patrol, and electronic warfare capabilities addresses specific vulnerabilities that Eastern European nations identify based on current threat assessments rather than general military modernization objectives. Nordic joint air policing of Baltic airspace under NATO's enhanced vigilance framework demonstrates how regional cooperation creates operational capabilities that exceed what individual nations could achieve independently. This arrangement enables continuous air defense coverage through shared resources and coordinated procedures that operate seamlessly across national boundaries. The success of this model shows how practical cooperation based on shared operational requirements can produce immediate security benefits without requiring extensive institutional frameworks or lengthy negotiation processes. Eastern European defense leadership is shifting the balance of power within NATO by demonstrating that smaller nations can achieve military capabilities that exceed those of larger allies when measured against specific operational requirements. Poland establishes itself as a regional security provider with defense and deterrence strategies designed for collective security of NATO allies bordering the Baltic Sea. This leadership role reflects capability development that enables Eastern European nations to contribute substantially to alliance operations rather than depending primarily on larger allies for security provision. These nations prepare for scenarios where Western European support may be limited by developing regional cooperation mechanisms that operate independently of broader European frameworks. The Nordic defense cooperation strengthens joint operational planning and information sharing, including cyber defense and civil-military coordination, through bilateral agreements that enable rapid response without extensive consultation processes. This regional approach recognizes that effective defense cooperation requires compatible operational procedures rather than formal institutional structures that may impede practical coordination. The European Union's adjustment of budget policies to enhance defense spending allows member states to allocate existing cohesion funds toward defense-related projects, including dual-use products and infrastructure that enhance military mobility. The €392 billion cohesion fund transformation into a performance-based model demonstrates European recognition that defense capabilities require immediate attention and flexible funding mechanisms. These policy changes enable Eastern European nations to accelerate capability development while maintaining fiscal responsibility and democratic oversight of defense investments. The transformation of Eastern European defense capabilities represents a fundamental shift in European security architecture that extends beyond immediate military modernization to long-term strategic autonomy development. These nations demonstrate that focused investment, clear strategic priorities, and streamlined decision-making processes can produce military capabilities that exceed what larger countries achieve through traditional procurement approaches. Their success challenges assumptions about the relationship between national size, economic capacity, and defense effectiveness while providing a model for rapid capability development that other European nations struggle to replicate. Yet the impressive political commitments and procurement achievements of Eastern European nations reveal a more complex challenge facing all European defense planners: the fundamental question of whether Europe's industrial base can actually deliver the capabilities that political leaders are promising to fund. The industrial reality gap. The disconnect between European defense ambitions and actual industrial capacity represents one of the most critical vulnerabilities facing European security planners today. European Union member states have increased their defense spending dramatically, with EU 27 defense expenditure reaching €326 billion in 2024, up from €214 billion in 2021, according to Consilium data. This substantial increase reflects growing commitment to enhance defense capabilities in response to evolving security challenges. However, this massive financial commitment masks fundamental weaknesses in European defense industrial capacity that prevent these investments from translating into meaningful military capabilities at the speed and scale required for strategic autonomy. The European defense industry turnover hit €158.8 billion in 2023, with significant investment in major platform procurement, according to Economist reporting. This growth occurred across military aeronautics, naval, and land system sectors. While these numbers suggest a robust and expanding industry, they reveal production capacity that remains insufficient for European nations seeking independence from American defense suppliers. The industrial base that produces these impressive revenue figures operates at capacity levels that cannot meet current demand, let alone support the dramatic expansion required for strategic autonomy. Production bottlenecks create severe limitations on Europe's ability to achieve defense independence across multiple critical domains. Ammunition production represents the most visible constraint, with European manufacturers unable to meet current demand despite substantial orders and financial commitments. The European Union allocated €500 million specifically to boost ammunition production capacity, but building new production facilities requires years of development before reaching operational capacity. Artillery shell production bottlenecks force European nations to compete for limited supplies while Ukrainian forces face ammunition shortages that affect their operational effectiveness. These production constraints demonstrate how industrial capacity limitations translate directly into strategic vulnerabilities that financial investment alone cannot resolve quickly. The timeline required to build industrial capacity for true strategic autonomy extends far beyond current political planning horizons and defense budget cycles. European defense companies report that establishing new ammunition production lines requires approximately 3 years from initial investment to full production capability. Aircraft manufacturing capacity expansion requires even longer development periods, with new production facilities typically needing 5 to 7 years before reaching operational capacity. Shipbuilding capacity faces similar constraints, with European naval yards requiring years to expand production capacity for modern military vessels. These timeline realities mean that current defense spending increases, regardless of their scale, cannot address strategic autonomy requirements within the timeframes that current security challenges demand. European defense companies struggle to scale up production to meet current demand due to supply chain constraints and workforce limitations that developed during decades of minimal defense investment. The defense industry workforce reached 581,000 jobs in 2023, representing an 8.9% increase compared to the previous year. While this growth demonstrates industry expansion, it reveals workforce capacity that remains insufficient for supporting dramatic production increases. The military aeronautics sector accounts for approximately 217,000 jobs, while the combined land and naval sectors employ 364,000 workers. These employment levels represent substantial growth, but highlight the years of workforce development required to support the production capacity that strategic autonomy would demand. Supply chain challenges facing European defense manufacturers extend beyond workforce constraints to include raw materials and critical components that European suppliers cannot provide domestically. European defense industrial policy must address dependence on non-European suppliers for key technologies, components, and raw materials that create vulnerabilities in defense production capacity. The fragmentation of the European defense market compounds these challenges, with national industries often prioritizing domestic suppliers over multinational cooperation that could achieve economies of scale and improve efficiency. This industrial fragmentation leads to inefficiencies and delays that prevent European defense companies from achieving the production capacity that strategic autonomy requires. Critical components and raw materials that Europe depends on external suppliers for include advanced semiconductors, rare earth materials, and specialized alloys that support modern military systems. European defense manufacturers rely on suppliers outside Europe for components that affect everything from electronic warfare systems to missile guidance technology. These dependencies create vulnerabilities that extend beyond immediate supply chain disruptions to fundamental questions about European ability to sustain defense production during extended conflicts or international crises. The concentration of critical material supplies in countries that may not share European security interests creates strategic risks that defense planners must address through industrial policy changes and supply chain diversification. European defense industrial policy restructuring aims to address these challenges through initiatives including the European Defense Industry Program, which projects €1.5 billion in funding allocated over several years. The €310 million EDIRPA fund supports immediate industrial capacity development, while programs like the Germany-Poland Joint Frigate Command in Rostock demonstrate practical cooperation mechanisms. However, implementing these programs faces significant obstacles, including complex decision-making processes and political pressures that favor domestic suppliers over efficiency considerations. The European Defence Fund allocated €8 billion to boost defence research and development, while €300 million supports joint defence procurement and €500 million targets ammunition production capacity expansion. Investment requirements for achieving meaningful defense industrial independence exceed current European financial commitments by substantial margins. Defense investments reached €102 billion in 2024, representing more than 30% of total defense expenditure, and a record high that demonstrates unprecedented commitment to capability development. Defense equipment procurement spending reached beyond €90 billion, corresponding to 88.2% of defense investments and representing a year-on-year increase of more than 50%. Despite these substantial investments, European defense officials acknowledge privately that achieving true strategic autonomy would require sustained investment at even higher levels over extended periods to build the industrial capacity that current security challenges demand. Different European nations approach defense industrial development through varying strategies that reflect their individual capabilities and strategic priorities. Some countries focus on developing niche capabilities in specific domains, while others attempt to maintain broader industrial bases that support multiple defense sectors. The European Union adjusts spending policies to permit member states to allocate existing cohesion funds toward defense-related projects, allowing investments in dual-use products and infrastructure that enhance military mobility. The €392 billion cohesion fund transformation into a performance-based model requires countries to meet specific targets to receive funding, creating incentives for efficient defense industrial development. European leaders face difficult choices between immediate defense spending that addresses current capability gaps and long-term industrial investment that could provide strategic autonomy over extended periods. The €16.4 billion allocated to security and defense-related activities under the 2021 to 2027 multi-annual financial framework supports research and development, military mobility enhancement, and industrial production capacity expansion. However, these investments compete with other priorities, including social programs and economic development, that affect political support for sustained defense industrial investment. The hard choices facing European leaders reflect the reality that achieving strategic autonomy requires sustained political commitment and financial investment that extends beyond current budget cycles and electoral timelines. These industrial constraints become particularly acute when European leaders consider the scenarios they may soon face regarding the conflict that has driven much of their defense planning. The gap between industrial capacity and political ambitions creates vulnerabilities that could prove decisive in determining Europe's role in shaping the continent's future security architecture. The negotiation nightmare. European security planners must now confront the harsh reality that diplomatic solutions to the Ukraine conflict remain elusive, with Russia's demands unchanged since 2022, according to his Vestia interviews. The prospect of meaningful negotiations creates calculation complexities that extend far beyond immediate ceasefire arrangements to long-term security architecture questions that European leaders must address without clear precedents or reliable frameworks. These potential diplomatic outcomes represent more than theoretical exercises because they will determine whether Europe faces decades of instability, renewed Russian aggression, or genuine stabilization that enables long-term planning and investment in regional security infrastructure. The specific scenarios European planners must consider range from complete Ukrainian victory to various forms of territorial compromise that would create different security requirements for European nations. A scenario involving Ukrainian territorial concessions would require European nations to develop security guarantee mechanisms that could deter future Russian aggression while managing the political implications of accepting permanent territorial changes through military force. Alternatively, scenarios involving complete Russian withdrawal would still require European security commitments to prevent future conflicts through deterrence mechanisms that operate independently of American security guarantees. European nations are positioning themselves differently for various post-conflict scenarios based on their geographic proximity to Russia and their historical experience with Soviet occupation. Poland and the Baltic states advocate for maximum support to Ukraine regardless of diplomatic outcomes, viewing Ukrainian territorial integrity as essential to their own security interests. These nations argue that accepting territorial concessions through negotiations would establish precedents that could justify future Russian aggression against other European countries. Western European nations, including Germany and France, show more willingness to consider compromise arrangements that could end the conflict quickly, even if such arrangements require accepting some territorial changes. The security guarantee mechanisms Europe would need to implement for any peace agreement involve military commitments that exceed current European capabilities and political willingness to sustain long-term deployments. European nations would need to provide credible deterrence against renewed Russian aggression through permanent military presence, advanced weapon systems, and intelligence sharing arrangements that operate continuously rather than only during crisis periods. The European Peace Facility has mobilized €11.1 billion to address Ukraine's military and defense needs, but post-conflict security guarantees would require sustained commitments that could exceed current aid levels for extended periods. Different European nations demonstrate varying levels of willingness to make long-term security commitments to Ukraine that would extend beyond current aid programs to formal security guarantee arrangements. The EU has committed to a new multi-year support package for Ukraine, but individual member states express different levels of enthusiasm for security commitments that could involve military deployments and defense treaty obligations. Eastern European nations generally support comprehensive security guarantees that would include military presence and defense commitments, while Western European nations prefer economic and political support mechanisms that avoid direct military obligations. Experts warn that any ceasefire without security guarantees risks renewed conflict, according to ISW and SIPRI analysis. A temporary ceasefire without robust security guarantees could create dangerous instability where renewed conflict becomes likely once Russian forces rebuild their capabilities. The absence of permanent security arrangements would create situations where European nations must maintain high defense spending and military readiness indefinitely while managing the political and economic costs of sustained military mobilization. European defense planning is adapting to the possibility of prolonged confrontation through capability development programs that assume extended conflict with Russia rather than return to pre-2022 security arrangements. These planning assumptions require European nations to maintain defense spending levels and military readiness that would be unnecessary if genuine peace agreements could be achieved. The possibility of prolonged instability forces European planners to prepare for scenarios where current military aid levels to Ukraine must be maintained indefinitely while European nations simultaneously develop independent defense capabilities for their own security requirements. The only near-term diplomatic outcome that appears realistic involves prisoner exchange talks, as reported by Reuters. These limited diplomatic contacts highlight how far removed meaningful negotiations remain from current reality. European officials acknowledge privately that comprehensive diplomatic scenarios create lose-lose situations where compromise solutions satisfy neither Ukrainian security requirements nor Russian strategic objectives, while leaving European nations responsible for managing long-term consequences. The difficult decisions European leaders face about long-term security commitments reflect the reality that any sustainable peace agreement would require European nations to provide security guarantees that exceed current political willingness and military capabilities. These commitments would need to operate for decades rather than years, creating political sustainability challenges that European democratic systems may struggle to maintain through electoral cycles and changing government priorities. The security guarantee mechanisms would require treaty obligations that could involve European nations in future conflicts if Russia violates negotiated agreements. The timeline constraints facing potential diplomatic scenarios create urgency that conflicts with the deliberative processes that characterize European democratic decision-making. Diplomatic opportunities may emerge suddenly and require immediate European responses. About security commitments that would normally require extensive parliamentary debate and public consultation. These timeline pressures increase the likelihood that European leaders will make commitments during negotiations that prove difficult to implement or sustain through subsequent political and budgetary processes. The interconnection between diplomatic outcomes and European defense industrial capacity creates additional complexity because different scenarios require different capability development priorities. Prolonged conflict scenarios require sustained ammunition production and maintenance capabilities that support ongoing military operations. Peace scenarios with security guarantees require deterrence capabilities, including advanced weapon systems and intelligence gathering that demonstrate credible military presence. These different requirements affect European defense industrial investment decisions that must be made before diplomatic outcomes become clear. European defense officials worry that potential diplomatic scenarios could create security obligations that exceed European capabilities while reducing American security commitments that have traditionally provided deterrence against Russian aggression. The combination of increased European responsibilities and decreased American involvement could create security gaps that negotiations are supposed to resolve but instead perpetuate through different mechanisms. These concerns reflect the broader challenge of achieving European strategic autonomy through crisis management rather than deliberate capability development programs. The diplomatic challenges facing European planners stem from the reality that all potential outcomes create security requirements that current European capabilities and political systems are unprepared to address effectively. European leaders must prepare for commitments about future security arrangements while lacking the military capabilities and political sustainability mechanisms necessary to implement those commitments successfully over extended periods. These diplomatic uncertainties are converging with other indicators to create a moment of unprecedented urgency for European strategic decision-making, the point of no return. Current indicators suggest that European defense planners have reached a critical juncture where traditional assumptions about transatlantic security cooperation no longer provide reliable foundations for strategic planning. The U.S. defense focus on China may limit American engagement in Europe, as reflected in Biden administration security documents that prioritize Indo-Pacific challenges over European concerns. This shift creates uncertainty that extends beyond policy disagreements to fundamental questions about the reliability of American security commitments during periods when European nations face immediate threats requiring coordinated responses. The timeline constraints facing European leaders in developing independent capabilities create urgency that conflicts with the extended development periods required for meaningful defense industrial capacity. European defense expenditure between 2021 and 2024 rose by more than 30%, reaching an estimated €326 billion, representing about 1.9% of EU GDP in 2024. Defense investments in 2024 reached €102 billion, representing more than 30% of total defense expenditure and demonstrating unprecedented financial commitment to capability development. However, these substantial investments operate within industrial timelines that extend years beyond current political planning horizons, creating dangerous gaps between financial commitments and operational capabilities. Current geopolitical trends are accelerating the need for European defense autonomy through Russian hybrid warfare activities that operate below traditional military response thresholds while creating substantial security vulnerabilities. The Baltic states, Poland, and Romania face particularly intensive hybrid attacks, including arson, cyber attacks, and attempts to influence elections, demonstrating how Russian operations target European democratic institutions through methods that traditional alliance frameworks struggle to address effectively. These attacks exploit legal loopholes and prove difficult for authorities to attribute, creating security challenges that require European responses developed independently of American intelligence and military support. The potential consequences of failing to achieve strategic independence within the next few years include permanent dependence on unreliable allies during a period when global power dynamics are shifting away from Western dominance. The fragmentation of the European defense industry presents a major challenge to security independence, with the lack of unified approaches to defense procurement preventing economies of scale and inhibiting capability development. This fragmentation forces European nations to compete for limited defense supplies while maintaining dependencies on external suppliers for critical technologies and components that affect everything from ammunition production to advanced weapons systems. Private assessments of European defense officials reveal deep concern about the urgency of the current moment, with many acknowledging that the window for developing independent capabilities is closing faster than European political systems can respond effectively. These officials recognize that current defense spending levels, despite their historic scale, may prove insufficient for achieving true strategic autonomy given the industrial constraints and timeline challenges that characterize defense capability development. The European Defense Industry Program aims to address these challenges through cross-border collaboration and inclusion of small and medium-sized enterprises in defense contracts, but success depends on overcoming entrenched national preferences and complex decision-making processes. Other global powers are positioning themselves to exploit transatlantic divisions through coordinated efforts that combine military pressure with economic influence and information warfare designed to undermine European cohesion. Russia's hybrid warfare tactics specifically target European democratic institutions, while China pursues economic relationships that create dependencies limiting European foreign policy autonomy. These coordinated approaches demonstrate how global competitors recognize European vulnerabilities created by unreliable American partnership and seek to exploit these weaknesses through sustained pressure campaigns that operate across multiple domains simultaneously. The specific capabilities Europe must develop to maintain security without reliable American support include comprehensive defense industrial capacity that can produce ammunition, advanced weapon systems, and intelligence technologies independently of external suppliers. European nations need maritime patrol capabilities for Baltic Sea security, air defense systems for territorial protection, and cyber defense infrastructure for protecting critical civilian and military networks. These capabilities require not only financial investment, but also workforce development, supply chain security, and technological innovation that European nations must achieve through coordinated industrial policies rather than competitive national approaches. European public opinion is adapting to the reality of increased defense responsibilities through growing acceptance of military spending and defense cooperation that would have been politically impossible in previous decades. This cultural shift creates political space for leaders to make defense decisions without facing the public opposition that characterized European attitudes toward military investment during the post-Cold War period. However, sustaining public support for the defense spending levels required for strategic autonomy requires demonstrating tangible security improvements rather than theoretical capability development that citizens cannot easily evaluate or understand. The 2025 Council decision gives member states flexibility to spend 1.5% of GDP on defense projects, repairing the Zeitenwende momentum that had stalled in several key European countries. This policy adjustment addresses financial constraints by allowing defense projects to account for up to 1.5% of GDP, according to Concilium guidance, though this represents only a portion of the broader cohesion fund restructuring rather than complete defense conversion. These policy adjustments provide tools for increased defense spending, but do not address the underlying industrial and institutional obstacles that prevent European nations from achieving independent defense capabilities within the timeline that current security challenges demand. The war in Ukraine has highlighted European dependence on external suppliers while demonstrating the immediate consequences of insufficient defense industrial capacity during active conflict. The European Union's military support for Ukraine now almost doubles U.S. commitments, showing European willingness to provide financial resources for defense purposes. However, this support depends on defense industries that cannot scale production to meet demand, creating situations where increased spending does not translate into proportional capability improvements that strategic autonomy requires. The increasing use of hybrid warfare by Russia forces Europe to move from passive deterrence to coordinated defense of democratic institutions through enhanced cyber defenses, improved intelligence sharing, and strengthened societal resilience. These requirements demand capabilities that operate continuously rather than only during crisis periods, creating sustained resource commitments that European political systems must maintain through electoral cycles and changing government priorities. The challenge of sustaining these commitments while simultaneously developing independent military capabilities creates resource allocation problems that European leaders must resolve without clear precedents or established frameworks. The potential for Russia-Ukraine negotiations remains uncertain, with significant disagreements preventing agreement on basic terms that would enable meaningful discussions about conflict resolution. Russia continues demanding that Ukraine abandon NATO ambitions and recognize sovereignty over annexed territories, while Ukraine insists on full ceasefire and security guarantees that European nations would need to provide independently. These divergent positions suggest continued conflict that requires European nations to maintain current aid levels while developing independent capabilities for long-term security requirements. The convergence of these factors creates a moment when European leaders must confront fundamental questions about their continent's security future that cannot be deferred through incremental policy adjustments or diplomatic negotiations. European leaders must now make decisions that will determine their continent's security architecture for decades to come. The evidence from Munich 2025 reveals a stark reality that European leaders can no longer ignore. The window for achieving strategic autonomy is closing faster than European political systems can respond. The 5% GDP defense spending target agreed at The Hague represents recognition that current capabilities remain insufficient for independent security. European nations must immediately streamline procurement processes, accelerate defense industrial capacity development, and establish regional coordination mechanisms that operate without American participation. The €150 billion safe loans for joint procurement provide tools for linking industrial policy to capability targets, but success requires overcoming entrenched bureaucratic obstacles. NATO's 2025 review will determine if Europe meets its 3.5% GDP core defense goal, providing a concrete milestone for measuring progress towards strategic independence. European viewers should monitor June's NATO summit to see if the 5% GDP commitment translates into specific capability. Timelines with measurable deliverables rather than symbolic political declarations.